Okay, you just let me know.
I will just let you know.
When that is done.
Yeah, I know, right? What's my deal?
I don't know. I don't know.
Well, get ready, because you're almost on.
So today's topic is actually a little bittersweet because it deals with what many consider to be one of the great missed opportunities of Elvis's career. We even see with Elvis's inner circle and the people who were around during this time, different opinions on why exactly this didn't work out, how Elvis felt about it not working out, whether this was something that he intentionally put the brakes on, or if it had to do with the Colonel's meddling. We will talk about all of these factors in a few minutes.
Being the best investigative reporters I think in the world today.
We've heard from a lot of different people close to Elvis, their accounts and recollections on what happened here, but I've never really heard about it in any great depth from Barbra Streisand in her own words, with the exception of a few passing references in interviews that she'd given through the years, but never really a lot of insight or detail from her on her perception of what happened, how she felt about the lost opportunity. And so I was very excited to receive Barbra Streisand's autobiography, My Name is Barbra. This autobiography is no less than 1,000 pages, which is a lot of babs. But as a true card-carrying pop culture geek, I was really excited to read this book because through the years, La Streisand has worked with, met, or dated just about everybody, many legends in the entertainment industry. I was really interested to see what tidbits, stories, juicy little bits of gossip might be contained within these pages. And I was very excited to finally get the chance to hear, maybe in a little bit more detail in her own words, exactly what happened with Elvis's casting in A Star is Born. The answer to that question is surprisingly little. However, there were a few little tidbits in here that I'd never heard before. The idea of a 70s remake set in the then contemporary rock music scene was actually the brainchild of the iconic literary couple, spouses Joan Didion and John Donne. This was actually something that I didn't know. Joan and John, both being renowned writers who often worked on projects together, were at this time in their careers collaborating on some different screenplays. And Joan had the idea to write an updated script of A Star is Born set in the music world for a film that would star the legendary singer-songwriters, the criminally fabulous Carly Simon, and her ex-husband, James Taylor. James and Carly were kind of the first couple of rock at this time. They were glamorous. So it was a promising idea to put them together in a film. A Star is Born is one of those really enduring stories that kind of gets remade for every generation. So by 1976, pop culture was about due for a remake. Although the Joan and John script wasn't the one that was ultimately used for the movie, Joan did have some interesting innovations for the storyline that were important for the movie that we finally got. At this point, there had been 2 previous iterations of A Star is Born. One actually called What Price Hollywood, which is like such a great 1930s melodrama name for a movie. The second one being A Star is Born. A Star is Born being a great title as well, which really kind of stuck with the storyline for all future remakes. And probably will be the name of the next remake that we get in 20 or 30 years. The storyline centers around a young, unformed ingenue with dreams of becoming a star who's discovered by an older, more established star whose career is somewhat on the decline, who struggles with, in the movie versions, alcohol addiction, drowning their sorrows in alcohol and substance abuse. The older star helps the young ingenue get discovered and get a start in the entertainment industry. As her career begins to rise, his begins to decline more. They fall in love and get married. However, problems arise due to his frustrations and depression over the loss of his career while her success grows. Eventually, he comes to see himself as a liability to his wife's success. So in a sort of self-sacrificing effort to not get in her way, he chooses to take his own life, leaving her, of course, emotionally devastated, but proudly proclaiming that the show will go on. This is pretty timeless material. In addition to the various film versions that have been made of this story, it's also a trope that's really repeated itself in various films, stories, and books. And was even the inspiration for the 1981 song by The Human League, Don't You Want Me? So when Joan Didion had her brainstorm to turn this into sort of an expose of the 70s rock music scene, the most recent version to date at that time had been done in 1954. The 1954 version is hands down my favorite version. This, of course, is the classic musical starring Judy Garland and James Mason. This is really Judy Garland's high watermark as an actress. It was an opportunity for her to really show her range. And her loss of the Oscar that year to Grace Kelly for The Country Girl is often considered really one of the biggest snubs in Oscar history. And I would rank it on par with Austin Butler's loss last year for Elvis, which are not words I say lightly. In order to prepare to write the script, Joan and John spent a couple of weeks on the road with several different rock bands, including Led Zeppelin, to try to get a feel for the rock music scene at that time. Their original script really focused a lot on kind of the gritty underside of rock and roll. In order to distinguish this project as its own thing apart from the previous versions of the story, it had been retitled Rainbow Road. Once the script was completed, it was offered to Carly Simon and James Taylor.
Hi, Carly.
I read that shit you wrote about me.
Who declined, creating really plum parts for the right cast. The search was kind of on with all the big name divas of the day. In fact, before finding its way to Barbra Streisand, the script had already been offered to Diana Ross, Cher, Liza Minnelli, so they were really looking to pull out the big guns with the casting here. Now, how it found its way to Barbra Streisand is one of the more interesting elements of this story. At this time, Barbra was involved in a somewhat controversial relationship with John Peters, her former hairdresser. They were really kind of a favorite target of the tabloids at this time. After the success of A Star is Born, he did go on to become a mega successful film producer in the 80s. Films like Rain Man, Batman, Flashdance, films like The Color Purple, Caddyshack. However, the thing about John Peters, he's also kind of legendary for being a jerk. He's just one of those people that really developed a reputation in Hollywood as being brash, temperamental, egotistical, demanding, a little bit of a prima donna. Most recently, he was pretty hilariously sent up in the 2022 film Licorice Pizza, played by Bradley Cooper in what really kind of amounts to an extended cameo.
Which one's in charge? Are you in charge?
Yeah, I'm in charge.
May I just speak with you for a second?
Yeah, sure.
Thanks. You can tell your crew to stop.
Stop for a sec, guys.
So this is what I want to say to you. Do you know who I am?
Yeah.
Do you know who my girlfriend is?
Barbra Streisand?
Barbra Streisand.
Sand.
Sand, yeah, like sands. Like the ocean, like
Barbra
beaches.
Streisand?
No, like Streisand.
Sand.
Streisand.
Streisand.
Barbra Streisand.
Barbra Streisand.
It was also revealed in a Jezebel article from 2018 that Mr. Peters has been sued at least 5 times for sexual harassment by former female staffers and was ordered to pay at least one of them $3 million. Turning the clock back to 1974, before he really found his success as a film producer. Now, it is often described that John Peters and Barbra Streisand met because he was her hairstylist. To kind of flesh this out a little bit more, in one of the previous videos that we did, we talked a little bit about Larry Geller at the J. Sebring salon and how Jay Sebring sort of ushered in this model, a high-end hairstylist to the stars. But he had a number of people who either mentored under him or were inspired by him and kind of followed in his footsteps. John Peters was one of these guys. He considered Jay Sebring a real inspiration. He became a celebrity hairstylist himself. He quickly garnered the reputation also of being quite a ladies' man. And by the time fate brought him together with Barbra Streisand, he was making a bundle himself, running several very successful full hair salons in Hollywood. However, he had big dreams and he had aspirations of moving into Hollywood. His goal at the time was really to get into the business end of the film industry as a producer. And in many people's opinion, he used his relationship with Barbra Streisand as the meal ticket to do this.
That you're a hustler who latched onto a star. How do you feel about it?
A lot of it's very true. I am a hairdresser. I was a hairdresser for, or have been a hairdresser for 17 years. And I'm also a hustler in that I hustled my whole life to get what I want. And as far as latching onto a star, it's true that from the professional side, I could have never produced this movie without Barbra.
But you feel any good? Look, Ma, I'm a producer.
I think I'm great.
Why?
Because I work hard, and I have certain basic instincts that I think apply to, and specifically apply to the movie business.
What?
My taste, my ideas, sense of story, and my own particular feelings about other talented people and wanting to work with them.
How do you know that you're not going to ruin Barbra Streisand?
Well, because I'm not in control of Barbra Streisand. I mean, all Barbra and I do together, how we work together, is I make suggestions and give her my opinions, and she makes her own decisions.
There was a real sense with this relationship that he was a bit of a Svengali, a megalomaniac, controlling her. Of course, we never really know what goes on with people behind closed doors, but from the outside looking in of this relationship, there are some really valid reasons why people might have had this impression. And he used this meeting with her to very quickly charm her and begin a romantic relationship with her. Very quickly after becoming romantically involved with Barbra, John was managing her career and image, set his sights on producing her next film, and was really using this as a springboard to get into the movie industry. It's also really important to take into account here just how larger than life and huge Barbra Streisand's career was in the 1970s. She was a huge recording star. She had had a phenomenal success on Broadway and had parlayed this into a film career. Barbra was, in fact, one of the top 10 most bankable film stars of the 1970s, so the 70s were very good to her. So this love affair was a little controversial and just looked a little confusing to people from the outside. So with John having essentially taken the reins with Barbra's career at this time, he was really looking for the next film project. In 1974, he came across Joan Didion's script for Rainbow Road and really thought that this would be a great vehicle for Barbra. Barbra, on the other hand, felt a little bit intimidated by the part. Barbra was well familiar with the previous iterations of this story, but John Peters was not. He had never heard of A Star is Born, so without having that baggage when he was looking at the script, he saw it perhaps with fresher eyes, and he was able to talk her into agreeing to do the movie. Now, she had a few caveats for this. She found the original version of the script to be too cold, too clinical, to be a little bit too much like a documentary, too focused on kind of the gritty, dark side of rock and roll. And she felt that if this movie was going to work, it needed to be retooled a little bit to be warmer, to be more focused on the love story between the two leads. And she also, according to her, felt that it was important to just go ahead and claim it, call it A Star is Born, and be transparent about the intention behind the film. So by this point, we're brought up to speed to how Barbra became involved with the film. Here's the part where we start to get into the casting of the male lead. And this is where Elvis enters the story. Usually when I've heard this story, it has always been presented that Elvis was Barbra's first choice. Totally makes sense. Because of course you'd want Elvis for this, right? I think he would have knocked it out of the park. I actually do think it was a great loss that we didn't get the chance to say this. And I say this as somebody who thinks that Kris Kristofferson actually did a fantastic job in the part. Much like in the Judy Garland version, certain aspects of her image and career shaped her character. I think Elvis could have done something very similar for A Star is Born. I have to say that I think the 1976 version of A Star is Born, you know, as a pop culture artifact of the 70s, I think it is fantastic. As a movie, kind of so-so. I'm going to be totally honest. I don't think it's a great movie, but I do think it's a highly watchable movie. Well, I do think Kris Kristofferson's acting performance in this is fantastic, and I think he very much looks the part. Kind of the hard-living, rugged 70s hard rock singer. One of the things that's really off to me about the movie is that I don't think that they got the sound for this character right. You know, Kris Kristofferson is great, but he's a very different kind of musician. The love theme from the film Evergreen did win an Oscar that year. This film's attempt to really kind of capture the big sound of the 70s arena rock scene just don't convince to me. Considering that it starred two established musicians, which is where I think casting Elvis could have really improved the movie. So interestingly, according to Barbra, Elvis was really not her first choice for the film. Before Elvis ever came into the discussion as a casting choice, Kris Kristofferson had already been tapped for the part, informally cast, but not officially signed by this point. He was interested in the acting aspect of this part. He was really not that excited about the music. He wanted to be able to compose his own songs, but he was told by the filmmakers that he wouldn't be allowed to do that because it didn't match their vision for the film. In his words, he later said that he found the music he sang corny, and that was a factor that held him back from fully committing to the movie at first. I don't really blame him there. It was at this point when he was still very much in the running and very much still attached to the project, but the deal wasn't fully closed, that Elvis came into the discussion. And according to Barbra, this was really surprising to me because I'd never heard this before. It was actually not her idea to offer the part to Elvis. Elvis was John Peters' idol. He had an idea that he really thought it would be a stroke of genius to give the part to Elvis. Barbra makes it seem as if this was something that she wasn't fully sold on, but I have to say, I find that a little bit hard to believe. She remained really dedicated to the idea of Kris Kristofferson taking the part. They had, in fact, previously dated, so she felt comfortable with him. She really thought he had the look of what they were going for with the character. As we kind of get into Barbra Streisand and her role in A Star is Born, which extended far beyond acting, she was executive producer. She had final cut for the movie. Although she wasn't formally listed as a director on the film, she essentially co-directed it. She had a hand in everything. And by her own admission, she was a huge perfectionist. Her film production company, First Artist, had been given a $6 million budget by Warner Brothers. So as the executive producer, anything over that $6 million was going to come out of her own pocket. So she felt a great responsibility to oversee everything. She really felt that the full responsibility for delivering a quality project was on her shoulders. So with the amount of control that she really exerted over this movie, I find it very hard to believe that things would have ever reached the point where she was personally meeting with Elvis to offer him the part if she was not fully on board with it. So it's interesting also to hear that John Peters considered Elvis an idol and was the one who kind of brought him on board for this, because one of the details in Ginger Alden's book that Elvis told her, one of the reasons why he wasn't interested in doing the movie, was that when he had his meeting with Barbra and John about the film, he happened to look over at John Peters and noticed that he was yawning. So his takeaway from that was that he couldn't really see doing a film with somebody who seemed that disinterested in it. Elvis was first made aware of this project when John and Barbra came to see him perform in Las Vegas in March of 1975. Sometimes identified as April, Barbra and John had come to see Elvis perform. They met him backstage and they told him that they had a proposition for him. And according to Barbra, one of the first things that Elvis said to them, that he had put his unnamed lady companion at that time, he had put her in an airplane and had the pilot flying her around in circles above the International Hotel. When Barbra asked him why, he said that he had been trying to kind of prepare and get ready for the show, and she was kind of talking and driving him crazy and he needed a break from her. So he kind of looked at Barbra and said, she's still in the airplane flying above the hotel. What do you think I should do? She suggested that he have the pilot bring her back down and then have an honest conversation to her to gently explain that he needed his space. The canon version of what happened at this point was that in order to kind of get away from the chaos of backstage and be able to talk privately, Elvis invited John and Barbra, along with Jerry Schilling and Joe Esposito, into the closet in his dressing room so that they could talk more privately. Barbra and John made their big pitch to Elvis. Initially, he listened politely. However, by all accounts of this story, as they began to talk more about their ideas for this project, he very quickly got very excited about it. He really saw it as his opportunity to finally do the serious, dramatic role he always longed for. He was very flattered to have been personally approached by Barbra for the part. And I think it's worth noting here that in terms of their relationship, they had met a handful of times. They were, of course, both big headliners in Vegas. Elvis did have a professional respect for Barbra. He was initially all in. He told everybody how excited he was. And he kind of held on to this for a few days, just telling the guys about it, before he finally spoke about it to the Colonel. Things started to go sideways here. Now, when we hear different accounts of exactly what it was that broke down here, I think that this is one of those cases where all the different things that we hear could be true to some degree. By some accounts, Elvis had his heart set on this, and once it kind of made its way to the Colonel started sabotaging. And by other accounts, despite being initially really enthused about it, Once he had thought about it for a few days, he began to have second thoughts and asked the Colonel to kill the deal. The Colonel wasn't necessarily known for giving outright no's. The established pattern that we hear that he had time and time again was, rather than absolutely vetoing something and stopping it in its tracks, he would find small ways to make it seem so complicated to go through with it that there was no way it could possibly work. Playing up on Elvis's insecurities about things until he finally backed down and changed his mind. According to most accounts, he really began to kind of play up to Elvis the idea that these two are real novices, they've never produced anything before. You'd really kind of be putting yourself in the hands of two neophytes who don't really know what they're doing. He also played up on the idea that he didn't feel like Elvis was being offered what he was worth for the role, that they were trying to kind of sucker him, take advantage of him financially, underpay him. That as someone who had, in all fairness, had a little bit of a reputation of being not only a hard-driving perfectionist, but had been labeled by the public and the press as a little bit of a diva and a prima donna. Barbra Streisand would be far more concerned about her own interests than Elvis's. He was just bound to get shortchanged in this. Additionally, the Colonel also talked about the character that Elvis would be playing in this movie as a singer whose career is kind of on the decline and is becoming a bit of a has-been. His fans might not really like it. I think that whatever natural fears might have been there, the Colonel was really able to kind of play upon them a little bit. Of course, you know, the most famous example of this being the possibility of touring overseas. The Colonel just really had a way of making this sound so complicated, difficult, impossible, that it just was made to look as something that just simply couldn't be done. I think the idea that the Colonel might have pulled a similar tactic here is probably right on. From Barbara's perspective, she says she doesn't really know what went wrong with it. She wasn't the person who was kind of doing those frontline negotiations with the Colonel. Basically, she was just told that the Colonel was making a lot of really impossible demands. She says she was even told at one point that the Colonel himself wanted to be a producer. She just knew that within a very short period of time, Elvis was officially out of the running for the movie, and at that point, Kris Kristofferson was officially back in. Interestingly, when she talks about this, though, she says in a very almost kind of nonchalant, she had no regrets about Elvis, that from what she says, the whole time Kris Kristofferson was really her first choice. In her words, once Elvis was out of the running and Kris was back in, she never looked back. Now, as far as Elvis goes and how he felt about missing this opportunity, that's where we really get the mixed accounts. I think there could be aspects of truth in all of them. By some accounts, he was extremely crushed and disappointed and frustrated with the Colonel. By others, he was relieved. He mentioned aspects of the movie that he wasn't really crazy about. By others, he was uncomfortable with the fact that the character commits suicide at the end. And I think in other ways, as excited as he might have been about this movie, it did represent a risk, and there was fear with that, and there's always fear with taking risks. It's possible that maybe once things started to break down in the negotiations, he felt relieved. There was a sense of relief in not having to take that risk. There is, in the Elvis archives, a proposed contract that was sent from William Morris to Tom Diskin, which outlined the offer that Elvis was going to be given for the project. According to this contract, he was going to be offered $500,000, 10% of all the box office from the movie once it had reached the break-even point. And this one is really interesting because it kind of goes against what we hear sometimes. He was being offered top billing, 100% of the billing above the title in order to do the film. Sometimes when we hear about some of the demands that the Colonel started making that led to the filmmakers really having no choice other than to back away from Elvis because they just couldn't meet these demands. One that we often hear is that the Colonel was demanding top billing and the filmmakers didn't want to do it. That being documented in the proposed contract does kind of contradict that idea a little bit. What we usually hear is that there was some conflict over billing, Barbara wanting top billing, Colonel trying to wrangle it from her. Allegedly, the Colonel also asked for a salary increase to $1 million for Elvis. Elvis was being offered what I think most people would consider to be a fairly reasonable deal of 10% of all the movie's earnings after it hit the break-even point. The Colonel came back and said, no, in order for Elvis to do the movie, and this one is really the kicker, we are asking that he be paid 50% of everything this movie makes from the first dollar it makes. When you kind of hear of the Colonel saying things like this, It sort of gives me the impression that essentially he had to know that nobody in their right mind was going to say yes to that, right? So most likely this was his attempt to come up with some crazy demand that nobody would agree to. Hey, if for some crazy reason they end up saying yes to this, then cool. But at some point the Colonel's demands for this just got so over the top that there was really no way Barbra and her team could say yes to them, which was probably the Colonel's plan all along. I think it probably came down to the idea of control. I think the Colonel also probably astutely and correctly recognized that this wouldn't be the kind of situation that he was used to in Hollywood. Although it really had only been a few years since Elvis had done his final movie, this was a much different flavor of Hollywood than what the Colonel was used to dealing with. In the heyday of Elvis's films, because people knew that they had to go through the Colonel to get Elvis, and Elvis was such a hot property at that time, he had Hollywood executives eating out of the palm of his hand. He made a lot of really outrageous demands, and people said yes to them because they felt like they had to. And I think a lot of people just kind of gritted their teeth and tolerated technical advisor Colonel Tom Parker. I think the Colonel recognized that Barbra Streisand was probably not a likely candidate to do that. That represented, again, a situation where the Colonel wouldn't have control. That really was against the formula of Elvis movies. In the written response that he sent, he indicated that he had advised Elvis that they should continue to hold out for the deals they'd always gotten at the height of Elvis's film career. It's hard to say exactly what the Colonel was thinking here, but I think some of the major factors were kind of his overall lack of concern about artistic quality. He was much more about the bottom line, bringing as much money as he possibly could from a situation. And I just don't think that he saw the money-making potential here. I think he correctly recognized that Barbra Streisand was not going to let the Colonel walk all over her and call the shots, and she absolutely wouldn't have. I also think that one of the unfortunate things about the way that Elvis's post-army career was handled by the Colonel, it wasn't that he didn't have good ideas and things that were true triumphs and successes for Elvis, but he just didn't know when there was too much of a good thing. Whenever he found something that worked and made money, his tendency was really just to beat it into the ground rather than looking for fresh new opportunities. We saw this with the movies, we saw this with Vegas, we saw this later with touring. By the mid-70s, the Colonel's sensibilities as a manager and a promoter and his sense of the entertainment industry were also becoming a bit passé. The entertainment industry was changing, and the Colonel's sensibility in a lot of ways belonged to another time. The ultimate production and behind-the-scenes story of the 1976 A Star is Born ended up being pretty troubled and problematic. And although the movie was a whopping commercial success, in Barbara's own words, she had a lot of clashes with the director, Frank Pierson. It was somewhat of a tumultuous and stressful production. And taking that into account, with Barbra and the Colonel...
Barbra, the Colonel.
However, I really think that the older, more mature Elvis really could have turned in a different kind of more nuanced performance in this movie and really opened up a whole new chapter for himself at this leg of his career. It could have really changed the trajectory of Elvis's final years, given him a reason to rally, a reason to get in shape, and to get back in peak form, and been the kind of creative and professional triumph and challenge that he really may have needed in those final years. Additionally, it would have given him the opportunity to fulfill his long-held dream of having the chance to really prove himself as a serious dramatic actor in a quality film. He may have already reached a state of burnout to really be able to focus on this project and give it what it needed. And I think it was a real lost opportunity, not just for him, but for us as well. Now, Barbra says when she and Kris Kristofferson had their brief romance prior to making the movie, that he had a habit of leaving hickeys all over her neck, which I just found I was very distracted when I read that. Hickeys just don't seem like a very Kris Kristofferson thing to do. Kris Kristofferson just doesn't really seem like the hickey type. Seems like a bit more of a go-getter. Seems a bit more virile and kind of going in for the kill. I might just be projecting my own fantasies there and being weird.